Does he really have a black mane? There are no lions with black manes in all of Shanghai. She trained Damani for fun. Light. Horses? What kind of horses? Might be war horses if she trained bloody Damani for fun. Mistress Annan tells me you're a scoundrel, Toy. Her voice was cool, not cold. Composed. She turned toward him, face hidden in the shadows of her cowl. How many women have you kissed? The lion woke up and coughed, a deep sound guaranteed to raise the hair on anyone's head. Guan did not even flinch. Looks like rain's coming again, he said weakly. Solution will have my hide if I get you back soaked. He heard her laugh softly. What had he said that was funny? There was a price to pay, of course. Maybe things were going his way and maybe not, but when you thought they were, there was always a price. Bunch of chattering magpies, he complained to Aginan. The afternoon sat on the horizon, a red gold ball half hidden by clouds, casting the show in long shadows. There was no rain for once, and in spite of the cold, they were sitting hunched beneath the green wagon they shared, playing stones in plain sight of anyone who walked by. A good many did, men hurrying about some last-minute chore, children snatching the final chance to roll hoops through the mud puddles and toss balls before night fell. Women holding their skirts up glanced at the wagon in passing, and even when they were hooded, Matt knew what their expressions were. Hardly a woman in the show would speak to Matt Coffin. Irritably, he rattled the black stones he held gathered in his left hand. They'll get their gold when we reach Lugard. That's all they ought to care about. We shouldn't be poking their noses into my business. You can hardly blame them, Aginan drawled, studying the board. You and I are supposed to be fleeing lovers, but you spend more time with her than with me. She still had trouble not calling Tuan High Lady. You behave like a man courting. She reached to place her stone, then stopped with her hand above the board. You can't think she'll complete the ceremony, can you? You can't be that big a fool. What ceremony? What are you talking about? You named her your wife 3 times that night in Abu Dar, she said slowly. You really don't know. A woman says 3 times that a man is her husband, and he says 3 times she's his wife, and they're married. There are blessings involved, usually, but it's saying it in front of witnesses that makes it a marriage. You really didn't know. Matt laughed and shrugged his shoulders, feeling the knife hanging behind his neck. A good knife gave a man a feeling of comfort, but his laugh was hoarse. But she didn't say anything. He had bloody well been stuffing a gag in her mouth at the time. So whatever I said, it doesn't mean anything. But he knew what Aginan was going to say. Sure as water was wet, he knew. He had been told who he was going to marry. With the blood, it's a little different. Sometimes a noble from one end of the empire marries a noble from the other. An arranged marriage. The imperial family never has any other kind. They may not want to wait until they can be together, so one acknowledges the marriage where she is, and the other where he is. As long as they both speak in front of witnesses, inside a year and a day, the marriage is legal. You truly didn't know? Sure was sure, but the stones still spilled from his hand onto the board, bouncing everywhere. The bloody girl. Maybe she thought this whole thing was an adventure, or a game. Maybe she thought being kidnapped was as much fun as training horses or bloody Damani. But he knew he was
Hey, Free Week, man, how you doing?
He stayed away from the purple wagon for 2 days. There was no use running. He already had the bloody hook in his mouth, and he had put it there himself. But he did not have to swallow the flaming thing. Only, he knew it was just a matter of when she decided to jerk the line tight. As slowly as the show moved, eventually they reached the ferry across the Eldar, running from Alkindar on the west bank to Koromin on the east. Tidy little walled towns of tile-roofed stone buildings with 100 stone docks each. The sun was climbing high, hardly a cloud across the sky, and those white as new-washed wool. No rain today, maybe. It was an important crossing, with trading ships from upriver tied to some of the docks and big barge-like ferries crawling from one town to the other on long sweeps. The Shanshan apparently thought so too. They had military camps outside both towns, and from the stone walls beginning to rise around the camps and the stone structures going up inside, they had no intention of leaving soon. Matt crossed over with the first wagons riding pips. The brown gelding looked ordinary enough to an undiscerning eye. It did not seem out of place for him to be ridden by a fellow in a rough woolen coat with a woolen cap over his ears against the cold. He was not actually considering making a run for the hilly wooded ridge country behind Corrigan.
How you doing, free weed
not
man?
really considering. She was going to set the hook whether he ran or not. So he sat pips at the end of one of the stone ferry landings, watching the show cross over and trundle away through the town. There were Shanshan on the landings, a squad of beefy men in segmented armor, painted blue and burnt gold under a lean young officer with one thin blue plume on his odd-looking helmet. They seemed to be there just to keep order, but the officer checked Luca's horse warrant, and Luca inquired whether the noble lord might know of ground outside the town suitable for his show to perform. Matt could have wept. He could see soldiers wearing striped armor in the street behind him.
Terrible case of munchies.
Shops and taverns. A rockin' swooped
That's not so bad sometimes.
Wings, alighting outside one of the camps across the river. 3 or 4 of the snake-necked creatures were already on the ground. There had to be hundreds of soldiers in those camps, maybe 1,000. And Luca was going to put on his show.
It all depends what you got to munch on.
At
least, hopefully you have something to munch on.
Let the windowless purple wagon rumble off onto the stones. Satala was driving. Lucia sat on one side of her, peering out from the hood of a faded red cloak. On the other side, swathed in a dark cloak, so not an inch of her showed, was Tuon. Matt thought his eyes were going to fall out of his head. His heart did not pound its way out of his chest first. The dice had started up in his head, that rattling feel of dice rolling across a table. They were going to come up the Dark One's eyes this time. He just knew it. There was nothing to do except fall in beside the purple wagon, though, riding along as though life were wonderful. Riding along the wide main street through criers for shops and hawkers selling things from trays. And Shanshan soldiers. They were not marching in formation, and they eyed the brightly painted wagons with interest. Riding along and waiting for Tuon to shout. She had given her word, but a prisoner would say anything to get the shackles loosened. All she had to do was raise her voice and summon 1,000 Shanshan soldiers for rescue. The dice bounced and spun in Matt's head. Riding along, waiting for the Dark One's eyes. Tuon never spoke a word. She peeked curiously past the edge of her deep cowl. Curiously and cautiously, but she kept her face hidden, and even her hands, all wrapped in that dark cloak, and even huddling against Satala like a child seeking the protection of her mother in a strange crowd. Never a word until they had passed the gates of Corrigan.
36 there. Let's see what it is here.
Behind the town, where Luca was already gathering the show's wagons. That was when Matt really knew there was no escape for him. She was going to set the hook all right. She was just biding her time.
32 here.
He made sure all the Shanshan stayed in their wagons that night, and the Aes Sedai too. Nobody had seen any Suldam or Damani that Matt knew, but the Aes Sedai did not argue for once. Tuon did not argue either. She made a demand that sent Satala's eyebrows almost to her hairline. It was phrased as a request, in a way a reminder of a promise he had made. But he knew a demand when a woman made one. Well, the man had to trust the woman he was going to marry. He told her he had to think on it, just so she would not start imagining she could have anything she wanted out of him. He thought on it all the day that Luca put on his show, thinking and sweating while as many Shanshan as not came to gape at the performers. He thought on it while the wagons wound eastward through the hills, moving slower than ever, but he knew what answer he had to give.
Oh, did it?
On the 3rd day after leaving the river, they reached the salt town of Jurador, and he told Tuon that he would. She smiled at him, and the dice in his head stopped dead. He would always remember that. She smiled, and then the dice stopped. A man could weep. Chapter 29. Something flickers. This do be madness, Doman rumbled from where he stood with his arms folded as if blocking the way out of the wagon. Maybe he was. His jaw was thrust forward belligerently, sticking out a beard that was trimmed short, but still longer than the hair on his head, and he was working his hands like a man thinking of making fists, or grappling with something. A wide man, Doman, and not as fat as he looked on first glance. Matt wanted to avoid fists or grappling.
What do you mean where I'm at? I'm in New
He
Mexico.
finished tying the black silk scarf around his neck, hiding his scar, and tucked the long ends into his coat. The chance that there was anyone in Jirador who knew about a man in Abu Dar wearing a black scarf, well, the odds seemed good, even discounting his luck. Of course, there was always his being Taviran to be factored in, but if that was going to bring him face to face with Suroth or a fistful of servants from the Terrasen Palace, he could stay in bed with a blanket wrapped around his head, and it still would happen. Sometimes you just had to trust to luck. The trouble was, when he woke this morning, the dice had again been tumbling in his head. They were bouncing off the inside of his skull still. "I promised," he said. It was good to be back in decent clothes. The coat was a fine green wool, well cut and hanging almost to his knees in the turned-down tops of his boots. There was no embroidery. Maybe it could do with a little. But he had a touch of lace at his cuffs. And a good silk shirt. He wished he had a mirror. A man needed to look his best on a day like this. Picking up his cloak from the bed, he swung it across his shoulders. Not a gaudy thing like Luca's. Dark gray, nearly as dark as night. Only the lining was red. His cloak pin was simple silver knots, no larger than his thumbs. "She gave her word, Bale," Egenin said. "Her word. She will not break that, ever." Egenin sounded absolutely convinced. More convinced than Matt was, anyway. But sometimes a man had to take a chance, even if he was wagering his neck. He had promised. And he did have his luck. "It'd still be madness," Doman grumbled. But he moved grudgingly away from the door when Matt settled his broad-brimmed black hat on his head. Well, when Egenin motioned him aside with a quick jerk of her head, anyway. He kept his glower, though. She followed Matt out of the wagon, scowling herself and fiddling with her long black wig. Maybe she still felt uneasy with it. Or maybe it fit differently now that she had close to a month's growth of her own hair underneath. Not enough to go about bareheaded yet, in any case. Not till there was at least another 100 miles between them and Abu Dar. Maybe it would not be safe until they crossed the Damona Mountains into Murabni. The sky was clear, the sun just cresting the horizon, invisible yet behind the show's canvas wall. Morning was warm only compared to a snowstorm. Not the crispness of a late winter morning in the Two Rivers, but a chill that slowly bored deep and put a faint mist in your breath. The showfolk were scurrying about like ants in a kick.
It all depends what you're wanting. Some have deals on wax, some deals have deals on flour.
It looked and sounded like the start of a riot.
Every dispensary has different
There was no
days,
anger in any of the voices.
different
They
deals.
shouted and waved arms all the time, but it never came to blows when there was a show in the offing.
I guess it all depends on what you're looking for and how much.
They might be slow packing up for the road,
Excuse me.
but performing meant money. They could move fast enough for that. "You really do think you can marry her?" Egenin muttered, striding along at his side, kicking her worn brown woolen skirts. There was nothing dainty about Egenin. She had a long stride and she kept up easily. Dress or no dress, she seemed to need a sword on her hip. "There's no other explanation for this. Bale is right. You are mad." Matt grinned. "The question is, does she mean to marry me? The strangest people marry sometimes." When you knew you were going to hang, the only thing to do was grin at the noose. So he grinned and left her standing there with a scowl on her hard face. He thought she was growling curses under her breath, though he did not understand why. She was not the one who had to marry the last person on earth she wanted to. A noble woman, all cool reserve and her nose in the air, when he liked barmaids with ready smiles and willing eyes. The heir to a throne, and not just any throne, the crystal throne.
I don't know, to tell you the truth.
A woman who spun his head like a top and left him wondering whether he held her captive or she held him. When fate gripped you by the throat, there was nothing to do but grin. He kept a jaunty pace till he was inside of the windowless purple wagon, and then he missed a step. A cluster of acrobats, 4 limber men who called themselves the Chabana brothers, though it was plain as their noses they came from different countries, not just different mothers, rushed out of a green wagon nearby, shouting and gesturing wildly at one another. They spared a glance for the purple wagon and another for Matt, but they were too engrossed in their argument and trotting too fast for more. Corduron was leaning against one of the purple wheels, scratching his head and frowning at the two women who stood at the foot of the wagon's wooden steps. 2 women, both swathed in dark cloaks, faces concealed, yet there was no mistaking the flowered headscarf hanging out of the taller woman's cowl. Well, he should have known Tuan would want her maid along. Noble women never went anywhere without a maid. Bet a penny or bet a crown, in the end it all came down to a toss of the dice just the same. They had had their chance to betray him. Still, he was betting on a woman making the same choice twice running.
Hell yeah.
On 2
Always good getting some new flower.
What would make odds on that?
I can't remember the name of the flower I'm smoking right now.
Except they were already rolling. He met Selucia's cold blue stare with a smile and swept off his hat to make an elegant like to Tuan. Not too showy, with just a small flourish of his cloak. Are you ready to go shopping? He very nearly called her Milady, but until she was willing to say his name. I have been ready for an hour, Toy, Tuan drawled coolly. Casually lifting an edge of his cloak, she glanced at the red silk lining and tied his coat before letting the cloak fall. Lace suits you. Perhaps I will have lace added to your robes if I make you a cupbearer. His smile slipped for an instant. Could she still make him dock a veil if she married him? He would have to ask Aguinan. Light, why did women never make it easy? Do you want me to come along, my lord? Corduron asked slowly, not quite looking at the women now. He tucked his thumbs behind his belt and did not quite look at Matt either. Just carry, maybe? Tuan did not say a word. She just stood there looking up at Matt, waiting, big eyes getting cooler by the second. The dice bounced and rattled in his head. Well, he only hesitated a heartbeat before jerking his head to send the red arm away. Maybe 2 heartbeats. He had to trust his luck, trust her word. Trust is the sound of death. He stepped on that thought hard. This was no song, and no old memory could guide him. The dice inside his skull kept spinning. With a slight bow, he offered his arm, which Tuan examined as if she had never seen an arm before, pursing those full lips. Then she gathered her cloak and set off with Selucia gliding at her heels, leaving him to hurry after them. No, women never did make it easy.
Always like in the cover, most other
Despite
things.
the early hour, 2
at least over a
fellows with cudgels
sativa.
were already guarding the entrance.
I'll smoke
The
a
third,
hybrid, but
clear glass pitcher to take the coins and dump
I
them
try to
through a
stick
sliding iron-strap box on the ground.
stay
Each
away
of the
from
3 looked too
sativa.
clumsy to palm a copper without falling on his face. But Luca took no chances. 20 or 30 people were already waiting inside the heavy ropes that led to the big blue banner naming Luca's show, and unfortunately, Littell was there too, stern-faced in a dress sewn with crimson spangles and a cloak sewn with blue. Luca's wife trained bears. Matt thought the bears did their tricks for fear she might bite them. I have everything in hand, he told her. Believe me, there's nothing to worry about. He might as well have spared his breath. Littell ignored him, frowning worriedly at Tuan and Selucia. She and her husband were the only 2 showfolk who knew who they were. There had seemed no reason to tell either about this morning's jaunt.
I'm still smoking, but
would have had kittens. The stare Littell shifted to Matt was
if
not
I can avoid it, yeah, I'll stay away from it.
Remember, she said quietly, if you send us to the gallows, you send yourself. Then she sniffed and went back to studying the people waiting to get in. Littell was even better than Luca at judging the weight of a purse before the drawstrings were undone. She was also 10 times tougher than her husband. The dice tumbled on. Whatever had set them spinning, he had not yet reached the fateful point, the deciding point. She is a good wife for Master Luca, Tuan murmured when they had gone a little way. Matt looked at her sideways and resettled his hat on his head. There had been no mockery in her tone. Did she hate Luca that much? Or was she saying what sort of wife she would be? Or, burn him, he'd go as crazy as Dillman thought he was, trying to puzzle this woman out. She had to be the reason for the feel of the dice in his head. What was she going to do? It was a short walk away from the rising sun to the town.
No, do
Along
you?
a hard-packed road through hills that were trees.
Everyone likes different ones.
The road the way windmills and salt
Can't hate on that.
Staring straight ahead, they moved so purposefully, they seemed not to see anyone in front of them. Matt dodged a round-faced man and nearly walked right into him, which made him have to jump away.
The hybrids and the indica helped me more with relaxing and
would have run up the front of him if he had not jumped again.
Help with my pain.
Are you practicing a dance, Toy? Tuan said, peering up at him over a slim shoulder. Her breath made a faint white mist in front of her cowl. It isn't very graceful. He opened his mouth just to point out how crowded the road was, and suddenly he realized he could no longer see anyone beyond her at Salucia. The people who had been there were just gone, the road empty as far as he could see before it made a bend. Slowly he turned his head. There was no one between him and the show either, just the folk waiting in line. Than before. After the show, the road wound into the hills toward a distant forest, empty. Not a soul. He pressed fingers against his chest, fitting the fox-head medallion through his coat. Just a piece of silver on a rawhide cord. He wished it felt cold as ice. Tuan arched an eyebrow. Zalusha's stare named him fool. I can't buy you a dress standing here, he said. That was the point of this expedition. His promise to find Tuan something better than dresses that hung on her and made her look like a child in grown-up's clothing. At least he was pretty sure he had promised that, and she was perfectly certain. The needlework of the show's seamstresses met with Tuan's approval, but not the cloth they had available. Performers' costumes glittered with spangles and beads and bright colors, but the cloth was usually whatever could be found cheaply. Those who had better kept it and used it till it wore out.
They herb and shaved. They're still starting to
Jurador made its money
get
from
itchy.
salt, though, and salt made a great deal of money. The town's shops should offer any sort of material a woman could wish.
That's usually the longest I'll let it get.
Tuan shared a look with Salusha. The taller woman shook her head, a wry, rueful twist to her mouth. Tuan shook her head. And they gathered their cloaks and started toward the town's iron-studded gates. Women. He hurried to catch up again. They were his prisoners, after all. They were. Their shadows stretched out long in front of them. Had any of those people cast shadows before they vanished? He could not recall any of them breathing a mist, either. It hardly seemed to matter. They were gone. And he was not going to think about where they had come from or where they had gone. Probably something to do with being Taviran. He was going to put it out of his head. He was. The dice rattling away left room for nothing else. The gate guards seemed incurious about strangers, or at least about a man and two women afoot. Hard-faced fellows in white-painted breastplates and conical helmets with what looked like horsetails. They ran impassive eyes over the cloaked women, lingering suspiciously a moment on Matt for some reason, and then returned to leaning on their halberds and staring blankly at the road. They were local men, most likely. In any case, not Shonchan. The salt merchants and the local lady, Ethelin, who apparently said whatever the salt merchants told her to, had sworn the oaths of return without hesitation, and offered to pay a salt tax before they were asked. No doubt the Shonchan would get around to installing some sort of official here eventually, just to keep an eye on everything, but for the moment, they had more important uses for their soldiers. Matt had sent Tom and Julian both to make sure there were no Shonchan in Jurador before agreeing to this excursion. A fool could trip over his own luck if he was not careful. It was a prosperous, busy town, Jurador, with stone-paved streets, most of them wide and all lined with stone buildings roofed in reddish tiles. Houses and inns rubbed shoulders with stables and taverns, in a noisy jumble with a blacksmith's clanging hammer on an anvil here, and the racketing of a rug-weaver's looms there, and everywhere, it seemed, coopers hammering bands on tight barrels for transporting salt. Hawkers cried pins and ribbons, meat pies and roasted nuts from trays, or winter-wrinkled turnips and sorry plums from barrows. On every street, men and women stood guard over the display goods on narrow tables in front of their shops, and bellowed lists of what was offered within. Picking out the salt merchants' houses was easy, though. 3 stories of stone rather than 2, covering 8 times as much ground as any others, each with a columned walk overlooking the street and shielded by white wrought-iron screens between the columns. The lower windows on most houses had those screens, though not always painted. That much was reminiscent of Abu Dar, but little else was, beyond the olive complexions of the people. There were no deep necklines exposing cleavage here, no skirts sewn up to display colored petticoats. Women wore embroidered dresses with high necks right up to their chins. A little embroidery for the common folk, a great deal for the richer, who wore cloaks embroidered top to bottom and sheer veils hanging over their faces from combs of gold work or carved ivory stuck into dark coiled braids. The men's short coats were worked almost as thickly in colors just as bright, and rich or poor, most men wore a long belt knife with a blade a little less curved than those in Abu Dar. Rich or poor, the fellows did have a tendency to fondle their knife hilts as if expecting a fight, so maybe that was the same. The Lady Ethelana's palace appeared no different from the outside than the salt merchant's mansions, but it was located in the town's main square, a wide expanse of polished stone, where a broad, round marble fountain sprayed water into the air. People filled their buckets and big pottery water jars from pipes spilling into stone basins at the corners of other squares, though. The big fountain put out a smell of brine. It was a symbol of Jorador's wealth, pumped from the same source as the salt wells in the surrounding hills. Matt got to see a good deal of the town before the sun climbed even halfway to its noon peak. Every time Tuon and Selucia spotted a shop with silks displayed out front, they stopped at the long, narrow table to feel bolts of cloth and whisper with their heads together, waving off the attentions of the watchful shopkeeper. Those kept a very watchful eye until they realized Matt was with the two women. In their stout woolens, well worn and badly fitting, they did not look like customers for silk. Matt, with one side of his cloak thrown back to expose the lining, did. Whenever he tried to show an interest, though, women said they wanted you to show an interest. Whenever he got close enough to hear what they were saying, the women fell silent and looked at him, cool dark eyes and cool blue staring out of their deep cowls, until he fell back a step or two. Then Selucia would bend her head to Tuon's, and they would go back to murmuring and fingering silk, red silk, blue silk, green silk, smooth shimmering silk, and brocaded silk. Jorador was a very wealthy town. Luckily, he had tucked a fat purse of gold into his coat pocket. None of it seemed to be right, though. Inevitably, Tuon shook her head, and the pair of them glided away into the crowd, with Matt hurrying to keep up as far as the next shop, showing silks. The dice continued to bounce off the inside of his skull. They were not the only ones from the show who had come into the town. He spotted Eludra, her face framed by beaded braids, walking through the crowd with a gray-haired man who had to be a salt merchant from the amount of bright embroidery covering his silk coat in flowers and hummingbirds. What would the illuminator want with a salt merchant? Whatever she was saying to him, his pleased smile had added a few creases to his face, and he was nodding. Tuon shook her head, and the two women glided toward the next shop, ignoring the shopkeeper's deep bows. Well, most of those were directed at Matt. Maybe the skinny fool thought he wanted to buy silk for himself. Not that he would have passed up a new silk coat or three, but who could think about coats when he was waiting for those bloody dice to stop? Just a little embroidery on the sleeves and shoulders. Tom went by, clutching his bronze-colored cloak around him, knuckling his long white mustaches, and yawning as if he had spent the night awake. He might have. The Gleeman had not taken to drink again, but Lopen and Narim complained about him remaining awake till all hours, burning a lamp so he could read and reread his precious
mystery
letter.
pint.
What could be so fascinating in a letter from a dead woman? A dead woman. Like, maybe those people on the road? No, he was not going to think about that at all. Tuon plucked one fold of silk and let it drop as she turned away without trying another. Selucia gave a just stare before following, but the woman started back in her front. Matt offered her a smile. Affronted shopkeepers could lead to questions, and who could say where that might lead? He knew he could smile most women into feeling soothed. The round-faced woman sniffed at him and bent to smoothing the bolt of silk as tenderly as tucking in a babe. Most women, he thought sourly. Down the street, a woman in a plain cloak let her hood fall back, and Matt's breath caught in his throat. Edicina lifted her cowl again, but she took no hurry with it. The damage was done anyway, an Aes Sedai's ageless face displayed for anyone who knew what they were seeing. No one in the street gave a sign that they had noticed anything, but he could not see every face. Was anyone thinking of a reward? There might be no Seanchan and Jorador at the moment, but they did pass through. Edicina glided around a corner, and two dark-cloaked shapes followed her. Two. Had the Sildam left only one of their number in the camp to watch two Aes Sedai? Or maybe Jolene or Teslin was somewhere close by, and he had missed seeing her. He craned his neck, searching the throng for another plain cloak, but everyone he saw had at least a little embroidery. Abruptly, it hit him like a stone between the eyes. Every cloak he could see had at least a little embroidery. Where were bloody Tuon and bloody Selucia? Were the dice spinning faster? Breathing hard, he went up on his toes, but the street was a river of embroidered cloaks, embroidered coats, and dresses. It did not mean they were trying to escape. Tuon had given her word. She had passed up a perfect chance for betrayal. But all either woman had to do was say 3 words, and anyone who heard them likely would recognize a Seanchan accent. That might be sufficient to set the hounds on his trail. There were 2 shops ahead that seemed to be offering
Hey,
cloth,
Texas
one on either
buds,
side of the street.
how you doing?
Neither were the pair of dark-cloaked women at the
Cheers
tables
to
out
you,
front.
too.
They could have turned a corner easily enough, but he had to trust to luck. His luck was especially good when the game was random. Bloody women probably thought it was a bloody game. Burn him, let his luck run good. Closing his eyes, he spun in a circle in the middle of the street and took a step. At random. He bumped into someone solid, hard enough to make them both grunt. A bulky fellow with a small mouth and a little poorly done scrollwork on the shoulders of his rough coat stood glaring at him when he opened his eyes, glaring and fingering the hilt of his curved knife.
Just hear smoking a bowl.
He was facing straight at one of the two shops. Pulling his hat down tight, he ran. The dice were rolling faster. Divided shelves stuffed with bolts of cloth lined the walls of the shop from floor to ceiling, and more stood stacked on long tables out in the floor. The shopkeeper was a scrawny woman with a large mole on her chin, her assistant slim and pretty and angry-eyed. He dashed inside just in time to hear the shopkeeper say, "For the last time, if you won't tell me what you're here for, I'm going to send Nelsa for the guards." Tuan and Solutia, faces still hidden in their hoods, were walking slowly along one wall full of cloth, stopping to touch a bolt, but neither paying the shopkeeper any heed. "They're with me," Matt said breathlessly. Tugging the purse from his pocket, he tossed it on the nearest clear table. The heavy clink it made landing put a wide smile on the shopkeeper's narrow face. "Give them whatever they want," he told her. And to Tuan he added firmly, "If you're going to buy anything, it's going to be here. I've had all the exercise I care for this morning." He would have had the words back as soon as they left his mouth if he could. Speak to a woman that way, and she flared in your face like one of Elutra's fire sticks every time. But Tuan's big eyes looked up at him from the shelter of her hood, and her full mouth curved slightly in a smile. It was a secret smile, for herself, not him. The light only knew what it meant. He hated it when women did that. At least the dice had not stopped. That had to be a good sign, right? Tuan had no need of words to make her choices, silently pointing out bolt after bolt and measuring with her small dark hands how much the shopkeeper was to cut off with her shears. The woman did the work herself, instead of delegating it to her assistant, and well she might, considering. Red silk in several shades went under those long sharp scissors, and green silk in a few shades, and more varieties of blue silk than Matt knew existed. Tuan chose out some fine linen in several thicknesses, and lengths of bright wool. She consulted Solutia over those in muffled whispers, but mostly it was silk. He got back much less of his purse than he had expected. Once all that cloth had been folded and neatly tied, then bundled into a larger length of coarse linen, at no extra charge, thank you very much, it made a mound as fat as a peddler's pack. It did not surprise him at all to learn that he was expected to carry the thing across his shoulders with his hat dangling in one hand. Dress your best, buy a woman's silk, and she still found a way to make you work. Maybe she was making him pay for speaking firmly. He earned plenty of stares from gaping fools as he made his way out of the town behind the two women. They glided along smug as cats full of cream. Even cloaked and hooded, their backs said it all. The sun was still well short of midday, with a line of people waiting to get into the show stretched down the road almost to the town. Most gaped and pointed as if he were a painted fool. One of the big horse handlers guarding the coin box gave a gap-toothed smirk and opened his mouth, but Matt returned him a level look, and the fellow decided to put his eyes back on the coins going from townsfolk to glass pitcher to box. Matt thought he had never been so relieved to be inside Luca's show. Before he and the two women had gotten 3 steps inside the entrance, Julian came running up, for a wonder without Thera or his red cap. The thief-catcher's face could have been carved from ancient oak. Eyeing the people flowing past them into the show, he pitched his voice low and urgent. "I was coming to find you. It's Aginan. She's been hurt. Come quickly." The man's tone said enough, but worse, Matt realized the dice in his head were drumming now. He flung the pack of cloth at the horse handlers with a hasty injunction to guard it as close as the coin box, or he would set the women on them. But he did not wait to see whether they took him seriously. Julian darted back the way he had come at a run, and Matt ran after him, along the wide main street of the show, where noisy, gawking crowds were watching the 4 bare-chested Giovanna brothers stand on one another's shoulders, and contortionists in filmy trousers and glittering vests sit on their own heads.
Nice.
And a slack rope walker in spangled blue breeches climbing a long wooden ladder to begin her performance. Short of the slack rope walker, Julian dodged into one of the narrower streets, where laundry hung from lines between the tents and wagons. Performers sat on stools and wagon steps waiting to go on, and show children ran playing with balls and hoops. Matt knew where they were headed now, but the thief catcher ran too fast to overtake. Ahead he saw his green wagon. Littell was peering underneath, and Luca, in one of his bright red cloaks, was waving a pair of jugglers to move along. The two women, in baggy trousers and with faces painted white, like a noble's fools, took a good look under the wagon before they obeyed. As he came closer, he could see what they had been staring at. Coatless, Doman was sitting on the ground under the edge of the wagon, cradling a limp Aginin in his arms. Her eyes were closed, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her wig hung askew. That stood out for some reason. She always fussed so to keep that wig straight. The dice beat like thunder.
"This could be disaster,"
Luca growled, splitting his glower between Matt and Julian. It was an angry glower, though, not frightened.
"You may have brought me to disaster."
He shooed away a gaggle of wide-eyed children and growled at a plump woman in skirts that glittered with silvery spangles. Leora made leopards do tricks that even Latella would not try, and she merely tossed her head before gliding off. No one took Luca as seriously as he took himself. The man gave a start when Tuan and Salusha hurried up, and looked on the point of telling them to go too, before he thought better of it. In fact, he began to frown thoughtfully and worriedly. It seemed his wife had not told him about Matt and the women leaving the show, and it was clear they had been somewhere. The blue-eyed woman had the huge bundle of cloth on her back now, with her arms doubled behind her, though she stood straight despite the bulk. You would think a lady's maid was used to carrying things, but her face was a picture of frustrated irritation. Littell eyed her up and down, then sneered at Matt as if he were the reason the woman was thrusting her considerable bosom out. Luca's wife was very good at sneering, yet Tuan's stern expression made Littell nearly look mild. Judge peered out of her cowl, a judge ready to pass sentence. For the moment, Matt did not care what the women thought. Those bloody dice! Tossing his cloak back, he went to one knee and touched fingers to Aginan's throat. Pulse beat weakly, thin and fluttering. "What happened?" he asked. "Have you sent for one of the sisters?" Moving Aginin might be enough to kill her, but there might be time for healing if the Aes Sedai were quick. He was not about to say that name aloud, though, with people walking for curious stares before Luca or Littell hurried them off. Everyone moved quicker for her. Littell herself was the only one who really jumped for Luca. Doman spat. Despite his short cap of hair, that hilly on her beard that left his upper lip bare, he did not look ridiculous now. He looked afraid and murderous, a dangerous combination. "I did see her stab Aginin in the back and run. If I could have reached her, I would have broken her neck. My hand be all that's holding Aginin's blood in." "Where be that bloody Aes Sedai?" he snarled. So much for being careful with his tongue. "I be right here, Bail Doman," Jessalyn announced coldly, rushing up with Thera, who took one horrified look at Tuan and Salusha and latched onto Tuan, eyes on the ground. The way she began trembling, she might be there herself in a minute. The hard-eyed Aes Sedai made her face as if she had a mouthful of briars when she saw what lay in front of her, or maybe where it lay. But she swiftly crouched underneath the wagon beside Doman and clasped Aginan's head in her bony hands. "Jolene could be better at this than I," she muttered, half under her breath. "But I may be able." The silver fox head went cold against Matt's chest, and Aginin jerked so violently that her wig fell off, nearly pulling herself out of Doman's grasp as her eyes popped open wide. The convulsion lasted only long enough for her to sit halfway up with a frozen gasp. Then she slumped back against Doman's chest, panting, and the medallion became just a piece of worked silver again. He was almost accustomed to that. He hated being accustomed to that. Jessalyn slumped too, on the point of falling over until Doman shifted his grip on Aginin to steady the Aes Sedai with one hand. "Thank you," Jessalyn said after a moment, the words sounding dragged from her. "But I need no help." She used the side of the wagon to help her rise, though, her cold Aes Sedai gaze daring anyone to comment. "The blade did slide on her rib, and so did miss her heart. All she does need now be rest and food." She had not delayed to grab a cloak, Matt realized. In one direction, along the narrow street, a clutch of women in spangled cloaks was watching from in front of a green-striped tent, intent and focused. In the other, half a dozen men and women in white-striped coats and tight breeches, acrobats who performed on horseback, darted looks toward Tesla between putting their heads together to whisper. Too late to worry about someone recognizing an Aes Sedai's face. Too late to worry that one of them knew healing when he saw it done. The dice battered at the inside of Matt's head. They had not stopped. The game was not played out yet. "Who's looking for her, Julian?" he asked. "Julian!" The thief-catcher gave over, glaring at Tuan and Selucia, and murmuring to Thera, though he continued to pat the trembling woman. "Bannon and the Red Arms. Low. This." He stopped, soothing Thera long enough to gesture toward. The babble of voices was clearly audible, even at this distance. "All she needs is to lay hands on one of those fancy cloaks, and she can slip out with the first folk to leave. If we try stopping every woman with her hood up, or even try looking inside, we'll have a riot on our hands. These people are touchy."
Disaster,
Luca moaned, wrapping a cloak around himself tightly. Littell put an arm around him. It must have been like being comforted by a leopard, but in any case, Luca did not look much comforted. "Burn me, why?" Matt growled. "Brenna was always ready to lick my bloody wrist. I thought if anybody went over the edge." He did not even glance at Thera, but Julian still scowled at him darkly. Doman had stood up with Aginin in his arms. She struggled feebly at first. Aginin was not a woman to let herself be carried about like a doll. But eventually she seemed to realize that if she did her own feet, she would fall over. She sagged against the Ileaner's chest with a resentful glower. Doman would learn, even when a woman needed help, if she did not want it, she made you pay for giving it. "I'm the only one who knew her secret," she drawled in a weak voice. "The only one who might give it away, at least. She may have thought it would be safe to go home, with me dead." "What secret?" Matt asked. The woman hesitated for some reason, frowning at Doman's chest. Finally she sighed. "Brenna was leashed once. So were Bethaman and Sita. They can channel, or maybe learn to. I don't know. But the Idam worked on those three. Maybe it works on any Suldam." Matt whistled through his teeth. Now that would be a kick in the head for the Sean-Chan. Luca and his wife exchanged puzzled glances.
Give me 1 second, everyone. I'll be right back.
Eslin's mouth hung open. Aes Sedai's serenity washed away in shock. Selucia made an angry sound, though, blue eyes blazing, and dropped the bundle of cloth from her back as she took a step toward Doman. The quick flash of Tuan's fingers stopped her in her tracks, though it was a quivering halt. Tuan's face was a dark mask, unreadable. She did not like what she had heard, though. Come to think, she had said she trained Damani. Oh, burn him. On top of everything else, he was going to marry a woman who could channel? The sound of horses' hooves announced Harnan and the other 3 Red Arms, coming along the narrow way between the tents and wagons at a quick trot. Their swords were belted on under their cloaks, Metwin with a dagger almost as long as a short sword to boot. Corderon had his heavy crossbow hanging at his saddle, already drawn and latched. The crank at his belt would take a full minute to pull back the thick cord, but this way, all he need do was place a bolt. Harnan carried a double-curved horsebow with a bristling quiver at his hip. Bergen was leading Pips. Harnan did not bother dismounting, eyeing Tuan and Selucia suspiciously, and Luca and Littell with almost as much doubt. He leaned down from his saddle, the crude hawk tattoo sharp on his cheek. "Brenna stole a horse, my lord," he said quietly. "Rode down one of the horse handlers at the entrance getting out. Bannon's following her. He said she could reach Koroman sometime tonight. That's the way she's headed. She's moving a lot faster than the wagons did. But she's riding bareback. We can catch her with luck." He sounded as if that luck were a matter of fact. The men of the band trusted Matt Cawthon's luck more than he did himself. There did not seem to be any choices, really. The dice were still pounding in his head. There was still a chance they might fall his way. A small chance. Matt Cawthon's luck. "Get your people on the road as fast as they can pack up, Luca," he said, stepping up onto Pips. "Leave the wall and anything else you can't get onto the wagons fast. Just go."
Are you crazy? Luca spluttered. "If I try to chase those people out, I will have a riot. And they'll want their coin back."
Like the man would take up money with his neck stretched on the headsman's block. "Think what you'll have if 1,000 Sean-Chan find you here tomorrow." Matt's voice was as cold as he could make it. If he failed, the Sean-Chan would run Luca's show down in short order, however fast they flogged their horses. Luca knew it too, from the twist of his mouth, as if he had just bitten a rotting plum. Matt made himself ignore the man. The dice were drumming hard, but they had not stopped yet. "Julian, leave all the gold for Luca except one good purse." Maybe the man could bribe his way clear, once the Sean-Chan saw he did not have their daughter of the 9 bloody moons. "Gather everybody and ride out as soon as you can. Once you're out of sight of the town, take to the forest. I'll find you." "Everybody?" Sheltering Thera with his body, Julian jerked his head toward Tuan and Selucia. Leave those two in Jurador, and the Shonchan might stop with getting them back. It might slow them down, at least. You keep saying you're going to turn them loose sooner or later. Matt met Tuan's eyes. Big, dark, liquid eyes, and a smooth, expressionless face. She had pushed her hood back a little, so he could see her face clearly. If he left her behind, then she could not say the words, or if she did, he would be too far away for the words to matter. If he left her behind, he would never learn why she smiled those mysterious smiles. What lay behind the mystery? IT was a fool. Hibbs danced a few impatient steps. Everybody, he said. Did Tuan nod slightly as if to herself? Why would she nod? Let's ride, he told Harnan. They had to walk their horses through the crowds to get out of the show, but as soon as they reached the road, Matt put Pips to a gallop, Cloak streaming behind and head down to keep his hat from blowing off. It was not a pace he could keep a horse at for long. The road wound around hills and crossed ridges, occasionally cutting through where the rise was not too high. They splashed across ankle-deep streams and thundered over low wooden bridges crossing deeper water. Trees began to appear on the slopes again, pine and leatherleaf, showing green among the winter-bare branches of the others. Farms clung to some of the hills, low tile-roofed stone houses and taller barns, and now and then a hamlet of 8 or 10 houses. A few miles from the show, Matt spotted a wide man ahead of them, sitting his saddle like a sack of suet. The horse was a leggy dun, eating ground at a steady trot. He'd figured that a horse thief had an eye for a good animal. Catching the sound of their hooves, Bannon looked back, but he only slowed to a walk. That was bad. When Matt slowed Pips beside the dun, Bannon spat. Best wager we got is we find her horse run to death so I can track her afoot from there, he muttered. She's pushing harder than I figured with her bareback. If we push, we can maybe catch her by sunset. If her horse don't founder or die, that's about the time she'll make Corriman. Matt tipped back his head to glance at the sun almost straight overhead. It was a long way to cover in less than half a day. If he turned back, it could be a good distance the other side of Jurador by sunset, in company with Tom and Julian and the others. With Tuan. With the Shonchan knowing to hunt Matt Cawthon. The man who had kidnapped the daughter of the Nine Moons could not own enough luck to get off with being made Duck of Vale. And sometime tomorrow or the next day they would plant Luca on an impaling stake. Luca and Littell, Petra and Clarine and the rest. A thicket of impaling stakes. The dice rattled and bounced in his head. We can make it, he said. There was no other choice. Bannon spat. There was only one way to cover a great deal of ground quickly on a horse, if you meant to be on a live horse at the end. They walked the animals for half a mile, then trotted half a mile. The same at a canter, then a run, and it was back to a walk. The sun began to slide downward, and the dice spun. Around sparsely forested hills and over tree-topped ridges. Streams that could be crossed in 3 strides, barely wetting the horse's hooves, and streams 30 paces across with flat ridges of wood or sometimes stone. The sun sank lower and lower, and the dice spun faster and faster. Almost back to the Eldar, and no sign of Brenna except scuffs on the hard dirt of the road that Bannon pointed to as if they were painted signs. Getting close now, the fat man muttered. He did not sound happy, though. Then they rounded a hill, and there was another low bridge ahead. Beyond, the road twisted north to cross the next ridge through a saddle. The sun, sitting atop the ridge, blazed in their eyes. Corriman lay on the other side of that ridge. Pulling his hat lower for shade, Matt searched the road for a woman, for anyone, mounted or afoot, and his heart sank. Bannon cursed and pointed. A lathered bay was laboring its way up the slope on the other side of the river, a woman frantically kicking its flanks, urging it to climb. Brenna had been too anxious to reach the Shonchan to stick with the road. She was maybe 200 paces from them, and she might as well have been miles. The mount was on the point of collapsing, but she could get down and run within the sight of the garrisons before they could reach her. All she had to do was reach the crest, another 50 feet. "My lord," Arnon said. He had an arrow nocked, and his bow half raised. Gorderon held the heavy crossbow to his shoulder, a thick pointed bolt in place. Matt felt something flicker and die inside him. He did not know what. Something. The dice rolled like thunder. "Shoot," he said. He wanted to close his eyes. The crossbow snapped. The bolt made a black streak through the air. Brenna slammed forward when it hit her back. She had almost managed to push herself erect against the bay's neck when Harnon's arrow took her. Slowly, she toppled from the horse, sliding down the slope, rolling, bouncing off saplings, tumbling faster and faster until she splashed into the stream. For a moment, she floated face down against the bank, and then the current caught her and pulled her away, skirts billowing up on the water. Slowly, she drifted toward the Eldar. Maybe, eventually, she would reach the sea. And that made 3. It hardly seemed to matter that the dice had stopped. That made 3. Never again, he thought, as Renna floated out of sight around a bend. If I die for it, never again. They did not press, riding back eastward. There was no point, and Matt felt too bone-weary. They did not stop, though, except to breathe and water the horses. No one wanted to talk. It was the small hours of the night when they reached Jurador, the town a dark mass with the gates shut tight. Clouds covered the moon. Surprisingly, the canvas walls of Lucas Show were still in place just beyond the town, with a pair of bulky men wrapped in blankets, snoring unaware beneath the big banner as they guarded the entrance. Even from the road, in the dark, it was plain that wagons and tents filled the space behind the wall. At least I can tell Luca he doesn't have to run after all, Matt said wearily, turning Pips toward the banner. Maybe he'll give us a place to sleep a few hours. For all the world, Luca should give him his own wagon, knowing the man, Matt had hopes for clean straw somewhere. Tomorrow he would set out to find Tom and the others, and Tuan. Tomorrow, when he had rested. A greater shock waited inside Luca's huge wagon. It truly was roomy inside, at least for a wagon, with a narrow table sitting in the middle, and space to walk around it. Table, cupboards, and shelves all were polished till they glowed. Tuan was sitting in a gilded chair. Luca would have a chair, and gilded, when everybody else made do with stools, with Selucia standing at her back. A beaming Luca was watching Littell offer Tuan a plate of steaming pastries, which the dark little woman was examining as if she would actually eat something that Luca's wife had cooked. Tuan showed no surprise at all at Matt walking into the wagon. "Is she captured or dead?" she said, picking up a pastry with her fingers curved in that curiously graceful way. "Dead," he said flatly. "Luca, what in the light?" "I forbid it to toy," Tuan snapped, pointing a finger at him sharply. "I forbid you to mourn a traitor." Her voice softened slightly, but it remained firm. "She earned death by betraying the Empire, and she would have betrayed you as easily. She was trying to betray you. What you did was justice, and I name it so." Her tone said that if she named a thing, then it was well and truly named. Matt squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. "Is everyone else still here too?" he demanded. "Of course," Luca said, still smiling like a bull-goose fool. "The lady, the High Lady, forgive me, High Lady," he bowed deeply. "She talked to Marilyn and Sandar, and, well, you see how it was. A very persuasive woman, the lady, the High Lady. Often, about my gold. You said they were to hand it over, but Marilyn said he'd slit my throat first, and Sandar threatened to crack my head, and—" He trailed off under Matt's stare, then suddenly brightened again. "Look what the lady gave me." Snatching open one of the cupboards, he pulled out a folded paper that he held reverently in both hands. It was thick paper and white as snow. Expensive. "A warrant. Not sealed, of course, but signed. Valan Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders is now under the personal protection of the High Lady Tuan Athayim Kora Payandrag. Everyone will know who that is, of course. I could go to Shangjan. I could put on my show for the Empress. May she live forever," he added hastily, with another bow to Tuan. For nothing, Matt thought bleakly. He sank down on one of the beds with his elbows on his knees, earning a very pointed look from Littell. Likely only Tuan's presence kept her from clouding him. Tuan raised a peremptory hand, a black porcelain doll, but every inch a queen despite the shabby too-large dress. "You are not to use that except at need, Master Luca. Great need." "Of course, High Lady, of course." Luca bobbed bounds as if he might be kissing the floorboards any minute. All for bloody nothing. "I did make specific mention of who is not under my protection, Toy." Yuan took a bite of pastry and delicately brushed a crumb from her lip with a finger. Can you guess whose name heads that list? She smiled. Not a malicious smile. Another of those smiles for herself. Amusement or delight in something he could not see. Suddenly he noticed something. That little cluster of silk rosebuds he had given her was pinned to her shoulder. Despite himself, Matt began to laugh. He threw his hat down on the floor and laughed. With everything, all his efforts, he did not know this woman at all. Not a bit. He laughed until his ribs hurt.
Chapter 30. What the Oath Rod Can Do. The sun sat on the horizon, perfectly silhouetting the white tower in the distance, but the cold of the previous night seemed to be deepening, and dark gray clouds marching across the sky threatened a snowfall. Winter was diminishing, yet it had clung past when spring should have begun, loosening its hold fitfully. The noises of morning penetrated Egwene's tent, isolated as it was from everything around it. The camp seemed to vibrate. Laborers would be bringing in water from the wells, and extra measures of firewood and charcoal in carts. Serving women would be fetching sisters' breakfasts, and novices in the second sitting scurrying to theirs, those in the first and third to classes. It was a momentous day, though none of them knew it. Likely today would see an end to the spurious negotiations that were going on in Darine at a table under a pavilion at the foot of the bridge to Tarvalin. Spurious on both sides. Elida's raiders continued to strike with impunity on the other side of the river. In any case, today would be the last meeting for some time. Peering at her own breakfast, Egwene sighed and picked a tiny black fleck out of the steaming porridge, wiping it from her fingers on a linen napkin without looking closely enough to be sure that it was a weevil. If you could not be sure, then you worried less about what remained in the bowl. She put a spoonful into her mouth and tried to concentrate on the sweet slivers of dried apricot that Chesa had blended in. Did something crack under her teeth? It all feeds the belly, my mother used to say, so pay it no mind, Chesa murmured as if talking to herself. That was how she gave Egwene advice, without straying across the line between mistress and maid. At least she gave advice when Halima was not present, and the other woman had left early this morning. Chesa was sitting on one of the clothing chests in case Egwene wanted something or needed an errand run, but now and then her eyes strayed to the pile of garments that were to go to the washwomen today. She never minded darning or mending in front of Egwene, but in her book, sorting laundry would have been stepping over that line. Smoothing the grimace from her face, Egwene was about to tell the woman to go get her own breakfast. Chesa considered eating before Egwene finished another transgression, but before she could open her mouth, Nisao pushed into the tent, surrounded by the glow of Saidar. As the entry flaps fell, Egwene caught a glimpse of Sarin, Nisao's bald, black-bearded stump of a warder, waiting outside. The small sister's cowl was down, carefully arranged on her shoulders so the yellow velvet lining showed, yet she was clutching her cloak as though she felt the cold intensely.
Now I'm about to top it with some wax.
Chesa a sharp look. Chesa waited for Egwene's nod, gathered her own cloak, and scurried out. She might not be able to see the light of the power, but she knew when Egwene wanted privacy. Chiron Stang is dead, Nisao said without preamble. Her face was smooth, her voice steady and chill. Short enough to make Egwene feel tall, she stood as though straining for an extra inch. Nisao did not usually do that. 7 sisters had already tested for resonance before I got there. There is no doubt she was killed using Saidin. Her neck was broken, shattered, as if her head had been wrenched around full circle. At least it was quick. Misao drew a deep, unsteady breath, then realized what she had done and pulled herself up even straighter. Her warder is primed for murder. Someone gave him an herbal concoction to put him to sleep, but he will be trouble to handle once he wakes. She did not put the usual dismissive yellow twist on the mention of herbs, a measure of her upset, no matter how calm her face was. Egwene set her spoon down on the tiny table and leaned back. Suddenly her chair did not feel comfortable anymore. Now the next best after Lyanna was Boda Cawthon, a novice. She tried not to think of what else Boda was. With the extra days of practice, Boda could do the work almost as well as Chiron could have. Almost. She did not mention that, though. Misao knew some secrets, but not all. Anaya and now Chiron both blew Aja. Do you know of any other link between them? Misao shook her head. Anaya had been Aes Sedai 50 or 60 years when Chiron came to the tower, as I recall. Perhaps they had mutual acquaintances. I just don't know, Mother. Now she sounded tired, and her shoulders slumped a little. Her quiet investigation into Anaya's death had gotten nowhere, and she had to be aware Egwene was going to add Chiron. Find out, Egwene ordered, discreetly. This second murder would cause enough ruction without her adding to it. For a moment she studied the other woman. Misao might make excuses after the fact, or claim she had been doubtful from the start, but until then she was always a model of yellow Aja self-assurance and absolute certainty. Not now, however. Are many sisters walking about holding Saidar? I've noticed several, Mother, Misao said stiffly. Her chin rose within a fraction of defiance. After a moment, though, the glow around her winked out. She pulled her cloak tighter, as if she had suddenly lost warmth. I doubt it would have done Chiron any good. Her death was too sudden. But it makes a person feel safer. After the small woman left, Egwene sat stirring her porridge with her spoon. She did not see any more dark flecks, but her appetite was gone. Finally she rose and settled the seven-striped stole around her neck, then swung her cloak onto her shoulders. Today, of all days, she would not sit mired in gloom. Today, of all days, she must follow her routine exactly. Outside, high-wheeled carts trundled along the frozen ruts of the camp streets, filled with big water barrels or piles of split firewood and sacks of charcoal, the drivers and fellows riding alike, enveloped in their cloaks against the cold. As usual, families of novices hurried along the wooden walkways, usually managing to make their courtesies to passing Aes Sedai without slowing. Failure in the proper respects to a sister could earn a switching, but so could tardiness, and teachers were generally less tolerant than Aes Sedai encountered in passing, who at least might make allowances for why a novice went rushing by. The white-clad women still leapt out of the way at sight of the striped stole hanging from Egwene's cowl, of course, but she refused to let her mood be soured, any more than it already was, by novices curtsying in the street, slipping and sliding on the ice-hard ground, and sometimes almost falling on their faces before their cousins could grab them. Cousin was what members of the same family had taken to calling one another, and somehow that seemed to tie them closer together, as if they really were related, and close cousins at that. What did sour her mood were the few Aes Sedai she saw out and about, gliding along the walkways through ripples of curtsies. There were no more than a dozen or so between her tent and the Amerlin's study, but 3 out of every 4 were wrapped in the light of the power as well as cloaks. They walked in pairs more often than not, followed by any warders they had. They seemed watchful, too, enveloped in Saidar or not, cowls swiveling constantly as they scanned everyone in sight. It minded her of the time spotted fever had struck Emmons Field, and everyone walked around clutching brandy-soaked handkerchiefs to their noses. Doral Barron, the wisdom then, had said that would help stave it off, clutching their handkerchiefs and watching one another to see who would be the next to break out in spots and fall over. 11 people died before the fever ran its course, but it was a month after the last person fell sick before anyone was willing to put those handkerchiefs away. For a long time she had associated the smell of brandy with fear. She could almost smell it now. 2 sisters had been murdered in their midst by a man who could channel, not to mention apparently being able to come and go as he chose. Fear was running through the Aes Sedai faster than spotted fever ever could. The tent she used as a study was already warm when she arrived, the brazier giving off a scent of roses. The mirrored stand lamps and table lamp were lit. Her routine was well known. Hanging her cloak on the cloak rack in the corner, she took her seat behind the writing table, automatically catching the unsteady chair leg that always tried to fold. All she had to do was follow routine. Tomorrow she could announce what had been done. Her first visitor was a shock, perhaps the last woman she expected to walk into the tent. Theodrin was a willowy, apple-cheeked brown, a copper-skinned demoni with a stubborn set to her mouth. Once she had always looked ready to smile. She glided across the worn carpets, close enough for the fringe of her shawl to brush the writing table. As she made a very formal curtsy, Egwene extended her left hand so the woman could kiss her great serpent ring. Formality must be met with formality. Romanda wishes to know if she can meet with you today, Mother, Linda Brown said. Softly, but there was a stubbornness buried in her tone, too. Tell her at any time she chooses, daughter, Egwene replied carefully. Theodrin offered another curtsy without changing expression. As the Brown moved to leave, one of the accepted brushed by her into the tent, pushing back her banded white hood. Imara was a thin woman and as small as
just a little tired.
It seemed a strong wind
But it's
away, yet she had a very
1:30
firm
for
hand
me.
with the novices given into her care, firmer than many sisters. But then she was hard on herself, and a novice's life was supposed to be hard. Imara's gray eyes rolled to the fringe on Theodrin's shawl, and her mouth twisted into a scornful grin before she smoothed it away to spread her snowy banded skirts for Egwene. Bright spots of color flamed on Theodrin's cheeks. Egwene slapped a hand down on the table hard enough to rattle the stone inkwell and the sand jar. "Have you forgotten how to be courteous to an Aes Sedai child?" she said sharply. Imara went pale. The Amyrlin did have a reputation, after all, and hastily made an even deeper curtsy for Theodrin, who acknowledged it with a wooden nod before gliding from the tent a good deal more swiftly than she had entered. What Imara stammered out, an Ilianer accent made thicker by nerves, was a request from Lelaine to meet with the Amyrlin. Romanda and Lelaine had been much less formal once, appearing unannounced and whenever they wished, but the declaration of war on Elida had changed a great deal. Not everything, but enough to go on with. Egwene returned the same reply to Lelaine that she had to Romanda, though in a more clipped tone, and Imara almost fell over, making her curtsy, and practically ran out of the tent. One more nail fastening together the legend of Egwene Alvear, the Amyrlin seat who made Sarela Bagand look like a goose-down pillow. As soon as the accepted was gone, Egwene raised her hand and frowned at what it had covered. The folded square of paper that Theodrin had deposited on the table, while kissing her ring. Her frown deepened when she opened it. The script that covered the small page managed to flow while being precise, but there was an ink blot on one edge. Theodrin was very neat. Perhaps she was trying to conform to the general view of Browns. Romanda has sent 2 sisters to travel to Cairhien and investigate some tale that has the yellow sitters buzzing. I don't know what the rumor is, Mother, but I will find out. I heard one of them mention Nynaeve, not as if she were in Cairhien, but as if the rumor was somehow connected to her. The fool woman had even signed her name. What is that, Mother? Egwene gave a start of surprise and barely caught the folding chair leg before it dropped her onto the carpets. She refocused her scowl on Swan, who stood just inside the entry flaps with her shawl on her arms and her leather folders pressed to her breasts. The blue-eyed woman's eyebrows raised slightly at Egwene's startlement. "Here," Egwene said irritably, thrusting the paper at her. This was no time to be jumping and twitching. "You know about Cairhien?" Of course she must, but Egwene still said, "Have you made the necessary changes?" Necessary changes. Light. She sounded as pompous as Romanda. She was on edge. Only at the last did she think to embrace Saidar and weave a ward against eavesdropping. Only after the ward was in place did she think that today might not be the best time for anyone to think she had private matters to discuss with Swan. Swan was not on edge. She had weathered storms, and managed to recover from drowning, some might say. Today was only a little windy to her. No need until we know for sure about the boats, Mother, she replied calmly, setting her folders on the table and neatly squaring them between the inkwell and the sand jar. The less time Boda has to think about it, the less chance she'll panic. Calm as a pond. Even two murdered sisters could not ruffle Swan. We're sending a novice of only a few months to replace one of them. A frown creased her forehead as she read the note, though. First Faelane goes into hiding, she growled at the paper, and now Theodrin brings this to you instead of to me. That fool girl has less brains than a fisher bird. You'd think she wants someone to find out she's keeping an eye on Ramonda for you. Keeping an eye, a polite way of saying spy. They were both practiced in euphemisms. That went with being Aes Sedai. Today, euphemisms grated on Egwene. Perhaps she does want to be discovered. Perhaps she's tired of Ramonda telling her what to do, what to say, what to think. I had an accepted in here who sneered at Theodrin's shawl, Swan. The other woman made a dismissive gesture. Ramonda tries to tell everyone what to do, and what to think. As for the rest, things will change once Theodrin and Faelane can swear on the oath rod. I don't suppose anyone will actually insist they be tested for the shawl now. Until then, they must take what comes. That isn't good enough, Swan. Egwene managed to keep her tone level, but it took an effort. She had at least suspected what she was letting those two in for when she told them to attach themselves to Ramonda and Lilane. She had needed to know what the sitters were scheming at, and still needed to know, yet she had a duty to them. They had been the first to swear fealty to her, and of their own free will. Besides which, much of what's said about Theodrin and Faelane can be said of me, too. If accepted can show them disrespect. Well, she had no fear of that. The sisters were another matter, especially the sitters. Swan, I have no hope at all of uniting the tower if Aes Sedai doubt me. Swan snorted forcefully. Mother, by now even Lilane and Ramonda know you're the Amerlin's seat in truth, whether or not they'll admit it. That pair wouldn't have fallen in line with Diana Ahriman. I think they're beginning to see you as another Adarna Nora Govna. That's as may be, Egwene said dryly. Diana was considered the White Tower's savior after Bonwyn's disaster with Artur Hawkwing. Adarna was believed to have been the most politically skilled woman ever to hold the staff and stole. Both had been very strong Amerlins. But as you've reminded me, I have to make sure I don't end up like Shane Chunla. Shane had begun as a strong Amerlin, firmly in charge of the tower and the hall, and ended as a puppet, doing exactly as she was told. Swan nodded in approval and agreement. She really was teaching Egwene the tower's history, and she often brought up Amerlins who had misstepped fatally, including herself. This is another matter, though, she muttered, tapping the note against her fingers. When I lay my hands on Theodrin, I'll make her wish she was a novice. And Faelane. If they think they can shirk off now, I swear I'll gut the pair of them like grunters on the dock. You'll gut who? Shiriam asked as she walked in through the ward in a gust of cold air. Egwene's chair almost dropped her onto the carpets again. She needed to get a chair that did not try to fold up every time she moved. She was willing to bet Adarna never jumped as if she had itch oak down her back. No one who concerns you, Swan said calmly, putting the paper to one of the table lamp's flames. It burned quickly, right to her fingertips, and then she mashed it out between her hands and brushed the ash away. Only Egwene, Swan, and Lyanna knew the truth of Faelane and Theodrin, and the two sisters themselves, of course, though there was a great deal neither of them knew either. Shiriam accepted the rebuff with equanimity. The fire-haired woman seemed to have recovered completely from her collapse in the hall. At least, she had recovered her outer dignity for the most part. Watching Swan burn the note, her tilted green eyes might have tightened a little, and she did touch the narrow blue stole hanging from her shoulders as if to remind herself that it was there. She did not have to accept Swan's orders. Putting her keeper in that position had seemed too harsh to Egwene in the end, but Sheriam knew very well that Swan had no need to accept her orders either, which had to gall her now that Swan stood so far beneath her in the power. Knowing there were secrets she was not privy to had to gall her as well. Sheriam would have to live with it, though. She also had brought a paper which she laid on the table in front of Egwene. I met Tiana on the way here, Mother, and told her I'd give this to you. This was the first report on runaways, though those no longer came every day or even every week, since the novices had been organized into families. Cousins supported one another through frustrations and tears, and managed to talk one another out of the worst mistakes, like running away. There was only one name on the page, Nicola Treehill. Egwene sighed and set the paper down. She would have thought Nicola's greed for learning would have kept her feet still, no matter how frustrated the woman grew. And yet she could not say she was sorry to see the end of her. Nicola was conniving and unscrupulous, willing to try blackmail or whatever else she thought would advance her. Very likely she had had help.
Excuse me. All right, everyone, I'm going to call into his life for tonight. Well, I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.